Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Billi FitzSimons.
I'm Zara Seidler.
The federal government released its annual budget last night. The government, led by Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, had two big decisions to make: what to spend money on and where to get that money from. There were several announcements on both of those things, from tax cuts to increased help to first home buyers. TDA was in the budget lockup from 1:30 p.m. yesterday, with our team Harry, Emma and Lucy in Parliament House until late last night, breaking down what was included in the budget papers. We will explain what you need to know in today's podcast.
Billi, somehow budget has come around again. We find ourselves sitting in this studio once again talking about how, as you said, the government is planning to spend its money and bring in that money.
We were reflecting before. We think this is our sixth budget together.
It's quite remarkable. It's a lot of budgets, a lot of numbers. Thankfully, I've never actually had to be in the lockup. All of the heavy lifting is done by our journalists who are locked in there, as you said, with nothing. They just are there with their brains and a whole bunch of budget papers.
Yeah, so for those who don't know how it works, literally journalists from around the country go to Parliament House in Canberra. They are literally locked up. They have access to no internet, basically no access to the outside world except for the budget papers that are put in front of them. There's literally hundreds and hundreds of those pages, and it's their job to decipher exactly what is in that, and then at 7:30 p.m. they can publish it to all of the different publications.
And that's why you see that kind of mad rush just as it hits 7:30. If anyone has news apps downloaded, you'll get a bunch of push notifications. And certainly from TDA, you will have seen last night, there were a whole host of posts at the same time covering every single element of the budget, which is what we're going to talk about today. Billi, why don't you start by just, talking about the headlines? It's sometimes hard to understand what the big headlines of a budget are. In this one, it seems like there's kind of one big one and then several other small ones.
Yeah, the big one is definitely they have announced a tax cut, which I don't think many people were expecting. So the government has announced a tax cut for the lowest tax bracket, which, because of how Australia's tax system works, will mean that everyone earning more than $45,000 will receive a tax cut of $268 from the 2026-27 financial year. So that will come into effect from July next year.
Okay, and so how will that work?
So at the moment, workers pay a 16-cent tax on every dollar earned between $18,200 and $45,000. Now, that rate of 16 cents per dollar will drop to 15 cents per dollar from July next year, and then it will drop again in 2027 to 14 cents. So it's a tax cut from 16 cents per dollar to 14 cents per dollar in 2027. Now, Treasurer Jim Chalmers was asked by ABC journalist Sarah Ferguson on the 7:30 report last night if this would increase inflation. He said this announcement wouldn't add to inflation because he argued they have got the balance right of providing tax relief, but in a responsible way. So not giving too much too soon, basically.
Yeah, I believe he said it was a modest tax cut. So the government themselves trying to say this is not life-changing, this is not huge, but it is a small step in their minds for easing that cost of living crisis that we are experiencing.
Exactly.
I do, before we go on, just want to highlight, of course, that this budget was handed down in the context of an upcoming election. And so we are hearing and talking about now what the government proposes to do if it remains in power. There is, of course, a chance that they will not remain in power and that, for example, this tax cut won't happen. The coalition has already said that they will not support this specific plan that Labor has put forward. And so if the coalition were to win power at the upcoming election, we could be seeing a very different kind of environment here.
Yeah, the Shadow Treasurer, Angus Taylor, has basically said this isn't a budget for the next year. This is a budget for the next 5 weeks. Honestly, it depends on exactly what happens at the election and whether Labor wins or the coalition wins.
Yeah.
But yes, very good point that this is kind of a temporary budget. So everything that we say comes with the caveat that it could not happen.
Yeah, exactly. All right, Billi, I want to move on to another area that I know our listeners care deeply about, and that is housing. What did Labor set out in its budget for housing?
So the government announced that it is going to increase spending to help first home buyers getting into the market, and they're going to do that through their Help to Buy scheme, which is their predominant policy to help first home buyers, which is predominantly young people. So under this scheme, the ownership of a property is split between the government and a first home buyer. So I think it's something like the government owns about 40% of a home and they share that equity, and then the first home buyer owns the other 60%. Now, currently the scheme is open to individuals making $90,000 annually or couples and single parents making $120,000 annually. Now, what the government announced yesterday in the budget is that they are going to increase those income thresholds to $100,000 individually and then $160,000 as a couple. So that was the big announcement for first home buyers yesterday, and the applications for that will open later this year.
I'd be curious to understand how many more people will now be eligible under this change by the government because, on paper, moving it from 90K to 100K, those people that are eligible, their incomes, I'd be really keen to understand how many more people will be now able to access this scheme, but certainly something that will come out in the wash over time.
Well, I think the idea with that is that they are increasing it in line with inflation, not necessarily increasing it by any substantial amount.
Yeah. Okay, so Billi, that's housing. What about renting?
So there wasn't too much announced in this area, and we have to keep in mind that state governments are more responsible for renters than the federal government. But there was the announcement that the federal government plans to implement a framework called A Better Deal for Renters, and that will target evictions and also rental increases. Now, the way this will be implemented is through the National Cabinet, which is a meeting between all of the state and territory leaders and the federal government. And so they've said that they're going to speak to the National Cabinet to talk about changing regulations across the country. But again, renting is more of a state government issue than a federal one.
So that is housing and renting, some of the things that we heard from the budget. I want to turn now to workers. There was a really interesting announcement by the government pertaining to non-competes.
Yeah, this was super interesting and also probably one that not a lot of us were expecting.
Yeah.
So the government announced changes to non-compete clauses, which, if you don't know what they are, they prevent workers switching jobs within certain industries. They're also known as no-poach clauses, and they just stop staff from being hired by competitors, usually within a certain time frame after they leave a company.
Yeah.
Now, what the government announced last night is that they actually want to ban non-compete clauses for most workers, or for all workers that are earning less than $175,000 a year, which is, of course, most workers. The government said that this will impact millions of people who they say, this is a quote, are handcuffed to their current job because of these clauses. And they think that it will result in workers who currently have this in their clause seeing an increase to their wage by 4% a year. The government's plan will require legislation to pass, and if it passes, it wouldn't come into effect until 2027.
Yeah, this is such an interesting one, and especially that the government is positioning it as a kind of economic uplift, that there are a lot of reasons why non-competes may or may not be used. But here the government is saying, no, if we are to ban them for certain workers, we will see an increase in workers' wages. It's a really interesting argument there by them. There were obviously a bunch of other things both included in the budget but also announced earlier. We reported earlier this week that the government's going to extend an energy rebate that it has had in place. So there'll be an $150 power bill discount that will be applied automatically, but we already knew that. So that was included in the budget. Billi, what happens now? Now that the government has handed down its budget, but we are looking at a potential election coming soon.
So the thing that happens every single time there is a budget is the budget is handed down on the Tuesday, and then on the Thursday, the opposition leader of the day delivers their budget reply. And they'll tell us what they think of this budget. Angus Taylor has already told us that, no surprises, they don't love this budget.
I was going to say, we aren't going to have to wait long to hear what the coalition thinks.
No, I mean, an opposition never really loves the government of the day's budget.
We'd love to find an example of that.
Yeah.
Maybe during COVID, maybe maybe there was like some...
Don't
no,
think
I don't think so.
But we'll hear in more detail exactly what they don't like about this budget. And then, like we've mentioned, we have an election that is due by the 17th of May. So we are now just about 6 weeks out, I think. I don't know if my maths is exactly right there, but we are very close to an election, and all of the measures that the government has announced in the budget, I'm sure will come up as key election issues in the coming weeks.
Yeah, look, we are hearing that it could be called as early as Friday. So even just a day after this budget reply. And I think that will be interesting because it will mean that the budget and the budget reply are almost seen as campaign measures themselves, and trying to separate budget measures from campaign measures. It's an interesting time to be watching and reporting on politics. So, Billi, thank you so much for explaining all of that and for breaking down everything we need to know about the budget. That's all for today's podcast. We'll be back later today with a very special headlines. You'll have to tune in to see what it is.